Thank you very much for that introduction. Amelia and I are really indeed very happy to be here today at the Overseas Development Institute at the launch of this book, Vulnerability in Developing Countries. ODI is a very highly valued and formidable think tank in the development field, and for us to be able to engage with them, as well as with the enthusiastic participants to their events, is for us a real privilege. So thank you for hosting us here. But also ODI has played a part in the project that this book emanates from, particularly ODI staff Kate Bird and Martin Prowser, who contributed a key chapter to this book. We are sorry, of course, that Kate cannot be here due to personal reasons. We are also happy to be at the ODI because the ODI is in London. This is not only because London is relatively close to Amelia and I's alma maters, Kent and Warwick, and also former workplaces, Sussex and Oxford, but it's also because it's the home of DFID. And DFID has been a key supporter of UNU-WIDER through many years and also to this project. So we're very happy to see Tim also on behalf of DFID here today. We are here to share with you some insights from this book, as well as the broader project on fragility in development, and to discuss our concerns about a seemingly growingly vulnerable globe. So I will start off talking about who is vulnerable to what, after which my colleague Amelia will apply this to a special case of small island development states to illustrate the importance of looking at vulnerability and resilience. So I'm going to talk about who is vulnerable and to what. Now, almost more than half a century ago, John F. Kennedy made the remark that vulnerability is one of the supreme realities of our times in this planet. And of course, he was speaking during the Cold War. If we, however, go back not 50 years, but 20 years ago, then we found that 20 years ago, if we look at the world in that cross-section of time, that it was quite an optimistic time. Nelson Mandela stepped as a free man from prison. The Berlin Wall had just fallen. There was an end of the Cold War. The Human Development Index was launched by the United Nations. So a lot of positive things happened 20 years ago. Britain also ceased to be an island 20 years ago when the Channel Tunnel was opened. And we also had, of course, 20 years ago, the three tenors who sang for the first time. So 20 years ago was a pretty optimistic time. What had happened in this intervening 20 years? Since then, we seem to have been inundated by a number of man-made and natural disasters. I think uppermost in everybody's minds, because we are still reeling from the shocks, is that of the financial crisis of 2008. And this has not been, unfortunately, a lone crisis. Since 20 years ago, there have at least been 13 major international financial crises, as I show in the overheads. You can look at the list of those. We have suddenly, it seems, when people have been proclaiming the end of history in 1990, we have suddenly stumbled into this world economy that just gets into financial crisis. And it's, of course, predicted that it's not the end of the financial crisis that we have seen. Also, more recently, the crisis in Greece is just re-emphasizing that financial crisis seems to be one of the major party spoilers, if you want to call it that, diminishing the optimism that reigned in 1990. But there has also been natural disasters. There you can see two graphs. The one is the damage caused by natural disasters since 1990, and you can see towards the later 2000s that the cost imposed by natural disasters has significantly increased. And so you can also see that the number of natural disasters reported seems to have been on the increase. And we learn from climate scientists that climate change might lead to an increase in the frequency of natural disasters. It's also the case that, to a greater extent, the victims of these natural disasters are in developing countries. So the impact of these disasters are unequal. It affects different countries in different ways. The victims of these disasters and the cost falls proportionately more on developing countries. We also have food and energy price shocks, especially more recently. There you can see what's happened over the last 20 years since the optimistic 1990s with food prices and with fuel prices. And energy and food are very important ingredients for development. Of course, these food and energy prices benefit some people and some countries more than others. Some countries are gainers as they may be exporting food crops and energy, and other countries are the losers as they are heavily dependent on these type of shocks. Hence, these shocks, again, exacerbate global inequalities. Now, what is the interrelationships between man-made disasters, natural disasters, and the concerns that these disasters might lead to increased global insecurity in the last 20 years' time? Now, that's a rather complex figure that you find there. It basically shows over this period of time changes in the number of natural disasters. It also shows the periods of major shocks, for instance, the 1998 financial shock, the Asian shock, the dot-com crisis of 2000. And you can see what has happened in the same time with the number of, for instance, battle-related deaths. These are deaths that take place due to civil conflicts. And you can see that there has been an increase in these type of conflicts during times of also a financial crisis. But you can also see there in the number of people that were victims that died during natural disasters over this period of time. And you can see there are two spikes. And the most predominant spike that you can see there in 2004 roughly is about 600,000 people that have been estimated to have died during the famine in North Korea. And this kind of like highlights one of the concerning effects or concerning trends during this period of time of the rise of fragile states. North Korea not being able to manage the vulnerability of their people towards famine could have prevented this number of people from dying. So we see that people tend to be more predominantly victims of disasters in countries where the state is fragile. And this is something that Amelia will take up in her lecture later on when she focuses on small island development states. But the question of fragility is key in the way that we think about surviving and getting over vulnerability to these different types of hazards. Now, amongst all of these things, one thing that's also different from 1990 is that now the threat of climate change looms large. And as these previous crises have also had a different impact upon different countries, we also see that in the predictions of, for instance, the World Bank with regards to the effect of climate change. This is a map taken from the most recent World Bank development report on climate change, which shows the changes in agricultural output due to climate change. And you can see that in green are the countries that are estimated to be the beneficiaries, where agricultural potential will actually increase, and the countries indicated in red that will be negatively affected. And if you look carefully at that map, you will generally see that developing countries tend to be more affected by climate change. And this is also a strong message in this particular World Bank report. So just like natural disasters, financial disasters, and even climate change has got a negative impact on the global economy, it's got a disproportionate impact on developing countries and exacerbates global inequities. These are just a table of figures showing you that the impact of these disasters are not negligible. The impact on developing countries are significant and long-lasting. For instance, you can see the impact on malnutrition and on infant deaths and unemployment. These effects tend to be long-lasting because people don't automatically and very easily get back into employment after a crisis. Malnutrition has got a lasting impact on the formation and quality of human capital in a country. And hence, these are also indicators of long-term impacts. And you can see that the estimates are from the food crisis that have struck, that it has led and affected 75 million people in malnutrition, 130 million extra people in poverty. The financial and economic crisis similarly lead to numbers in the upper 50 millions and increases in unemployment of almost 200 million. A more recent report from the World Bank also estimates an extra 50,000 deaths of infants in sub-Saharan Africa that they link to the global financial crisis. So hence, very serious implication. Just the financial crisis itself, there's been a lot written in the last year, so I'm not going to do too much about that. And ODI has done sterling work in terms of bringing the impact of the crisis under the attention of policymakers and the broader development community. But there you can see the exorbitant cost, just the amount of money that has been thrown at rescuing the financial system and providing financial stimulus over the last recession. You can compare that with the amount in the same year that was allocated to overseas development, official development assistance, or aid to developing countries on the far right-hand side, and you can see that it dwarfs it. In fact, an Oxfam report has indicated that if this amount of money was applied to poverty alleviation, it could have erased global poverty for 50 years. And the individual cost, also to taxpayers in developed countries, are very significant, as this figure clearly shows. All right, the point that I want to make, Chairperson, is that the world is seemingly a more vulnerable place, and that the great disparities, and the disparities are very great and proportionately covered by the developing countries. And this is also what we say in the foreword of this book, that while advanced economies are also affected very much by the specific crises, it is true that they have more bulwarks, that they have more security measures in place, and that they are therefore able to better cope with these type of crises. We also make the point that midway in this period, from 1990 to today, in 2000, the Millennium Development Goals were adopted, very importantly. But it's got a rather limited view of poverty. It aims to halve the number of people in extreme poverty by 2050 by half. It's a very static way of looking at poverty, just as the number of people below some international poverty line. And we are arguing in our book that it's better in view of this increased vulnerability in the world to think about people's vulnerability to poverty. What are the likelihood that they might fall into poverty in the future? What's the likelihood that they will remain in chronic poverty? And this links up with the important work that the Chronic Poverty Research Center has also done to focus on the fact that poverty can remain a sticky problem, so to speak. Now, what is vulnerability? Just to set the scene for us for the rest of the discussion about the book and its context, we look at vulnerability both from a micro and a macro level, where on a micro level we are talking about the risk of households falling in or remaining in poverty either due to idiosyncratic hazards or aggregate hazards. With idiosyncratic hazards, we mean factors influencing households or individuals related to their own personal characteristics or their own livelihoods. So, for instance, people's educational standards, their health standards are types of idiosyncratic characteristics that can influence their vulnerability to poverty. Many households are extremely dependent, say, for instance, on the mother of the household providing an income. And if they lose the head of the household through some natural disaster, that has got devastating consequences for the remainder of the family members. So that's a typical idiosyncratic hazard that a household might lose its breadwinner. There's also on a macro level there's also the covariate risk or aggregate risk, which would, for instance, if everybody in the community is similarly affected. And this often has got a more difficult impact, in the sense that with idiosyncratic risk, often insurance or the community support can provide assistance, but in the case of a covariate shock, everybody in the community might be equally affected, and that the insurance mechanisms might not be as well developed. Then there's also the macro level, where we look at the risk that a country might be adversely affected, and here it's also important to distinguish vulnerability to what? Is it vulnerability to a financial shock? Is it vulnerability to a natural hazard? Is it vulnerability to a political event that might happen? So it's important to denote on a macro level what it is that we are talking about when we talk about vulnerability. We also note that vulnerability is not necessarily the same as exposure. People may be exposed, and countries may be exposed to hazards, but they might not be at risk from being negatively affected because they have the means to protect themselves. So the extent that a household or a country is at risk from a particular hazard is a function of its exposure to that hazard as well as its coping mechanisms or its resilience. And this is also important for policy because we need to strengthen the coping mechanisms but also try to reduce the extent of exposure to the extent that it is possible. It's not always often possible, even desirable, to decrease exposure to a particular hazard or vulnerability, but it's definitely always necessary to improve possible coping mechanisms. We talk in the book about various measurements of vulnerability. I'm not going to deal with that because of time issues, but I just want to make you aware of that. Also how it is dealt with on a macro level. There are various vulnerability indices that have been constructed. And there's ongoing discussions on how to improve these, how to adapt these, how are they useful, etc. I don't want to get into much detail about that. What I do want to say is that we have an accompanying special issue of the journal Oxford Development Studies, which was published in September last year, which deals in detail with the measurement of vulnerability. And this is also available from the website, or you can contact us. There we deal in greater detail and also more critically with various ways in which, on a country and on an individual level, vulnerability can be measured and how the measurements can be improved. Now, in our book, I think we try to focus much more, especially towards the middle and later part of the book, on how people in developing countries cope with vulnerability. And we look specifically at vulnerability towards poverty or income deficiencies, health, natural hazards, and macroeconomic shocks, respectively, in the first and the second parts of this book. And I just very quickly want to share with you some of the main findings from the chapters, just by way of summary, to illustrate what is contained in the book. Chapter 2 deals with India, and the authors here take a very strong microeconometric approach to identify vulnerability to poverty and the number of people that are at poverty, and also try to find out what kind of risk is it really that matters for households. Is it idiosyncratic risk or is it covariate risk? And I find from using panel data from India from 1975 to 1984 that it's largely idiosyncratic risk that contributes most to vulnerability in India, about 37%, followed by covariate risk, about 22%. The paper in Chapter 3 focuses on, I think, a very topical issue, and that's the role of microfinance. And I focus on China specifically, which has seen significant eradication of poverty, but still millions of people remaining stuck. And they talk about the way in which the lack of financial institutions and microfinance might be hindering further reductions of vulnerability to poverty in China. The fourth chapter focuses on Tajikistan, which is a very interesting case to consider in the context of vulnerability, because it's a country that is making a transition from a centrally planned to a market economy, from a civil war which ended in 1998 to a post-conflict reconstruction, from economic collapse to growth, and from predominantly being a rural country to a more urban-dominated economy. And the authors look at the different factors which leads households to fall in and out of poverty. And what I found is that in this country in transition, there's quite a lot of people falling into poverty and getting out of poverty as well. So the mobility of households between poverty and out of poverty seems to be quite rapid in such a context. The Chapter 5 by Kate Bird and Martin Prauser looks at the case of Zimbabwe. And they use a qualitative research study where they look at 5 life histories of people to focus on how they cope. And what they found here is that although coping is important and people need to cope, they can often end up using adverse coping mechanisms. In other words, they cope in ways which do them lasting permanent damage. For instance, she notes that they note that in Zimbabwean case, children drops out of school and they rarely get back into school, in future. So the human capital is over the long term adversely affected. People engage in soil degradation as a result of desperate but unsustainable farming methods. People cut down on health expenditure, and some people get involved in criminal activities. All forms of adverse coping that accompanies extreme vulnerability. In Chapter 6 of the book, also dealing with India, but this time focusing on an area of India that has got one of the highest HIV/AIDS rates in the world, and I focus specifically on how adverse forms of coping here also contribute to chronic poverty, and specifically the case of migrants, which in their case study are more exposed to the risk of contracting HIV/AIDS. And they show that there are weaknesses in the programs, policy programs by government to combat HIV, because they don't look at the migratory behavior of people and the way in which this leads them to be exposed. Then we move on to another dominant crisis in recent years, food crisis, in which the authors Margarita Flores and Colin Andrews look at the extent of food crisis in the world, pointing out that by 2007, more than 34 countries needed emergency food assistance. And they looked at the issues of food insecurity, as well as international frameworks for monitoring and identifying to what extent countries are in real difficulties. Then we move on to an area of the world that has recently also been in the news, the Caribbean region, which has been particularly vulnerable to natural hazards. And the Chapter 8 in our book by Martin Higger and co-authors focuses on the exposure, how these countries are exposed to macroeconomic shocks due to the high concentration of their productive and foreign trade structures. And also focuses on issues that relates to the resilience. For instance, the fact that they are very small, that they are economically specialized, etc. The following chapter also deals with the small island development states in the Caribbean, where the author notes that a natural hazard does not always need to become a natural disaster. It really depends on the responses of government and to the kind of coping that people tend to assume, like in Chapter 5 on Zimbabwe. And Arts is specifically concerned about the role of women in natural hazards, showing that they are often leading in terms of the roles of caregivers and in post-disaster assistance. And she's calling for post-disaster resistance to be targeting women much more than it has up to now. The last chapter, Chapter 10, continues on small island economies and look at the financial situation, how they are vulnerable to the fact that they can lose a lot of income very suddenly due to external shocks, and that their macroeconomic policies are often too much constraining. And he discussed the example of Singapore, also a small island state, very vulnerable country to external trade, but one nevertheless that has achieved quite a remarkable degree of resilience and has used its macroeconomic policy to stabilize and promote growth rather than retard growth, as has often been the case. And hence, one needs to look at the way, and this is the message coming from the book, at strengthening coping. And I also want to mention here that in this book, one of the mechanisms of coping after a shock is for households or for countries to be provided by insurance. We did not deal so much with the case of insurance in this book because there's a previous wider study, Insurance Against Poverty, edited by Stefan Derkon, which is available from OU Press. And this, Chairperson, brings me to the end of my section. In the next section of the presentation, Amelia will be applying some of the messages from the book and some of the case studies from the book, as well as some of the related work that WIDER has done within this project to the case of small island development states. They would just point your attention to two complementary special issues. Firstly, of the Pacific Economic Bulletin, and secondly, of the Journal of International Development, which both deals with small island states in greater detail. And Amelia will also point your attention to a forthcoming special issue of the Journal of Development Studies, which is also, again, focused on small island states. So indeed, the small island states has been an important part of this project. And I think that the lessons learned from small island states is not just relevant for the small island state, but there's many lessons for developing countries in general. So I think on this point, let me ask Amelia to continue the presentation and deal with small island states and their vulnerabilities. Thank you very much.